My name is Bernadette Negrete. I work in creative practice and public programs. We have a very exciting conversation for you guys today. I'd like to take a few minutes to give a huge thanks to Amelia Nelson and Stephanie Lawrence in the back for organizing this program. And our wonderful speakers, Huascar and José Faus. Please be sure to check out A Layered Presence after the program if you haven't already seen it. With that, I'm going to hand over the introductions to my amazing colleague, Amelia.
Thank you, Bernadette. I have the distinct privilege of introducing our two poets today. José Faus is a visual artist, performer, writer, independent teacher, mentor, with an interest in the role of artists as catalysts for building community. He received degrees from the University of Missouri at Kansas City in both writing, creative writing, and painting. His chapbook, This Town Like That, was released as part of Press, and his book, The Life and Times of Jose Calderon, was published by West 39th Press. He maintains Querido Studio, a fine art studio in downtown KCK. Jose is a founder of the Latino Writers Collective and sits on the boards of the Latino Writers Collective, the Full Frame Initiative, UMKC Board of Governors Alumni Association, and Charlotte Street Foundation. Huascar Medina is the Poet Laureate Emeritus 2019 to 2022 of Kansas and a member of the Academy of American Poets Laureate Fellow. As a second-generation immigrant living in the heartland, Huascar pushes the boundaries between identity, location, focusing on cultural empathy, social cohesion, class structures, first-generation trauma, minority mental health, and internalized diasporic longing and belonging. Author of 2 books of poetry, When Mango Grows in Kansas and How to Hang the Moon, he is a lit editor for 785 magazine, a staff editor for the South Broadway Press in Denver, Colorado, and an op-ed writer for the Kansas Reflector, and a founding member and former chair of TopekaUnited.org, the founder of WordsSaveLives.org, and co-founder of Latinidad.us. Huascar works for Mid-America Arts Alliance as an Artists, Inc. program associate, providing professional development opportunities to artists in a 6-state region. As Bernadette mentioned, our program today is a conversation, not just between Jose and Huascar, but also between all of us here who have joined in the program today. We won't hold questions till the end of today's program. Instead, raise your hand when you have a question, and Jose or Huascar will welcome you into the conversation. Since we're recording today's program, they will also repeat your question to make sure that everybody has heard. With that, please join me in welcoming Jose and Huascar.
Like you said, it looks like a little tiny desk concert.
There won't be any singing by me, maybe they said.
No, when I was a young kid, a choir director went around the room after he had us all singing, and he heard something, and he had one of those looks like the sky is falling, and he walked around till he found me, and then he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Don't sing." I have not sung since.
When it comes to music, is there any music that inspires your work? Anything you listen to regularly?
I'd say the biggest influence for me of anything that's lasted, outside of some rock and roll, blues and jazz, but the one thing that it always sticks in my mind is the Rites of Spring, Stravinsky. I don't know why it was something that stuck with me, but I think it was the history of it being such a revolutionary work of art, and also because it was tied to ballet, which my mother was a dancer, so it's always been kind of a thing in my head about the arts and dancing in particular. So when I was exposed to that music, I heard it, and then the opening sound, it's this notes that just floats out of some ether, and the building up, and then later the percussive elements just seemed like really chaotic, and it's kind of the way I like for things to flow. I love smooth passages, and then I love abrupt things, and then repetition. So that's always been a piece of music that sticks to me. I think I've seen the orchestra here every time they performed it. I think they've done like 4 or 5 times that
Wow.
I've seen it. Yeah.
Jazz for me.
Oh,
I just
jazz.
love jazz. And
Yeah.
put any jazz on, I'll listen to it.
You do,
Bebop
I
jazz.
think, for Wynton Marsalis.
Yes, I appreciate Wynton Marsalis's work, especially the work he's done with his father. Standards too. There's a song in there that The Seductress. It's just there's a horn solo that's muted that just it's like a voice calling out into the abyss with so much emotion in it. There's no words that can actually capture what that is, but there's just a feeling with it every time I hear it. And sometimes it's despair, and other times it's this deep love that I have for something, and I'm not sure what it is. I just know that I want to be able to blow a horn that way in my own instrument in the future.
I think sometimes we do it with words, but we capture that feeling, that thing you're talking about, that little voice that comes out of somewhere. I hear that in poetry. I really like that. Kind of like I've been doing that thing with reading poetry for Poetry Month every day, and I'm always amazed at how I think I know a poem, and then I come back to it, I open it up, and I look at it, and I'm caught by something else that was different. It's like that little voice. All of a sudden, some phrase is speaking to you in a way you hadn't really heard it before. So that kind of, I guess that shares a lot with jazz too. That kind of,
Voices age, right? Like with experiences, and whenever I'm reading a work, the voice in the work changes with my lived experience. So I'm always bringing something to the work that I'm reading. So it's never the same. We were talking earlier that I'm going back and reading books that I read when I was younger just to see where I'm at, kind of get a sense of the direction I'm going in with my writing. And I'm not sure what direction it is. And I think it's the unknowing is beautiful, right? It's a new chapter of rediscovery for me right now.
yeah. I'd like to think I know where I'm going, but I'm always surprised where I end up. It's not where I started or wanted to go. I mean, it sounds cliche because it is a cliche, but it's so true, because I think it's like stepping into something and you're not certain of that first step, but once you take that step, there's no going back. So it feels like you're going to end up where you need to end up, and to try to control it, nah.
No.
And sometimes you do fall flat on your face. I've fallen flat many times.
Yeah, when I fall flat, it's an unfinished poem. It'll just sit there. But it's always that first step being the point of no return. I think it's just accepting that it's the journey, right, that we're on, as cliche as that may sound. But I really care about the process and the work. I think that's why I continue to do it. There's no destination on the other side. I don't ever think I'll be done writing poetry. Even poems I think were done, I don't think they're done anymore, right? Because my views have changed.
I don't think I heard the story about, Degas. He would go to people's houses, and he'd always bring this little set of paints, because he had given the work, or somebody had bought the work, and if they'd invite him to dinner, he'd come, but he'd take the time, he'd be looking at the work, and all of a sudden he'd pull out his paints and start painting on a painting. And so people got to the point where they didn't want to invite him to dinner. And I think I do that a lot with my poetry. There are times I don't like to read it as much, because all of a sudden I realize, oh man, God, why did I change that? Why did I? And then I even have some of the books, and I'll just scratch out the words, and then if I read them again, I'll have changed them. So they are never finished, I don't think.
I republish poems, and it's not out of laziness. Like, I'll put them in the next book because they're different now, because things have changed in them. Even just the line breaks could really change the tone of a piece.
Or there's another poem that picks up a conversation, something you left off in the other one, that it's kind of like an introduction to another poem. I have this line I wrote, I can tell you, man, because it's been in my mind since I was 18 years old. There was a guy that lived across the street from me. His name was Fred White. And if you lived in Westport, you knew him. He was older man, had longer hair than me, so I aspired to things. But I found out he used to own a bookstore. And so I always thought, oh man, that's my people, right? And I remember one time seeing him coming home, and he had this very rickety stairs. It was concrete, but they were all like broken up. And there was one rail, and it had snowed, it was winter, And I remember being in my bedroom looking across the street and seeing Fred just struggle to get up that thing. And immediately this phrase came to mind: I too long for spring, old man, grayly, wearily advancing. And I thought, oh, what a great line to a poem. And I spent the next 40 years trying to figure out where that line belonged until I finally realized that was the whole poem. But I tried to push it into things that it just never did. And I think that's the best lesson I've ever got, was it spoke to me and said, screw you. And I did. You'd be surprised how many poems it ended up in, because I was trying to make something, that line do something it just had already done for itself.
The poem was already there. You couldn't change it. You couldn't make it something it wasn't.
But I tried so many times, literally. Yeah.
I have a lot of work that's just sitting that I wrestle with, that I don't know what to do with, that I don't know if I'm prepared or I have the skill level to complete it yet. It may belong to something else, but maybe just leaving it as is, accepting that that's where the work is at, is also something worth me learning to do at this point in my career.
You know, I've thought about just making an epigram to a poem that will be published. Because it hasn't been published, I'm thinking anything, it just keeps hovering. Yeah.
I used to use the term boneyard when I had poems that weren't finished. You know, things I can go back and pull from and grab a line, you know, if it resembled another poem about, flowers, and I had this line about petunias, maybe this will fit in here. But it feels really artificial, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not as organic as it should be. So they just lie there, and I'm not sure what to do with them yet. In my mind, they're seeds, right, waiting to be planted, and I just gotta find the right soil. But I'm not sure.
You ever throw them away? You don't throw them?
I lose them.
Yeah.
The chaos of the day throws them away.
Yeah. I have this drawer where I throw my stuff in. I am the worst person for documenting things. I literally, once it's done, it kind of leaves me, and I forget sometimes whether I saved it or not. But I keep them in this drawer, a lot of this stuff. And I remember when this thing that's going on in Gaza started, it reminded me of, I think it was like 48 years ago, I wrote this poem after something that had happened in Lebanon. And I remember thinking, because you kind of feel compelled sometimes to respond to the world as it's taking place. And I thought, oh my God, it's time again. And I thought of a poem that I could write, and I couldn't. But I remembered I had written this poem, and I found it. And it was, the line of it is, it never rains in Lebanon, only bits of people, dogs, and cats. And that was like the ending line of the poem. And I thought, I think I still have that poem, because I never published or did anything with it. And I went through almost every layer of paper I could find, and I did have a lot of those little post-it notes with napkins that never went anywhere. But I found the poem, and it was illuminating, because I don't know why. I think it got printed in a student publication at the university, but it just disappeared. But it was so fresh in my mind that I guess I trust more my mental cabinet than I do my actual cabinet.
How do you contend with that, with the hardship that's around us, that surrounds us all the time? And do you go back to older work that might be able to console you, or is there new work that you feel like you have to produce for an audience to see that you're either in solidarity or against an issue?
That's a trippy question, because I was always, I don't know where the idea came from, but I do believe, and I've said this before, that poetry to me of all the arts is the most essential. And I've tried to understand why, but I think it's always that I remember the phrase that poets are the canaries in the coal mine. And I think that there was always a duty that while we can walk through the Garden of Eden and write poems about the Garden of Eden, the real essential part of the poet is to write the poems after leaving the Garden of Eden. This is what we lost, this is what we had, this is what we wish we retained, but here's the reality in which we move. And a part of me always says, I have to be true to that, but keep the memory of this, right? So there's always this line when you're trying. There's some poems I really mistrust because they become so political and so direct, and I want to just shout from the barricades. But at the same time, there's the sonic part inside of me that is trying to tone it down, trying to make it lyrical, trying to make it musical, trying to say, a canary sings in the coal mine. It doesn't scream, right?
Yes.
So how do you capture in words a song that'll make you accept or realize the condition that's taking place, but at the same time sing, whether against it or in recognition of there's still this idea. I'm not polemics are good. I mean, we can take to the barricades and scream these things, but rarely do we in polemics scream poetry, you know. And I think that's a fine line sometimes, but I think it is the calling of the poet to do that.
To put a song out of the darkness in a way, and possibly bring the audience into that mind.
Well, what you said about jazz, right, is like the emotions that you can pull out, right? In music, we don't think about it. I mean, how many of us have cried in a song, right? There's a song you hear, and if there's no words in it, it's even more intriguing to me. Is I've had very emotional moments hearing some music that I don't know for what reason it brings tears to my eyes. And I think that's what I would love to see the poetry do, just get that moment in you where it's about the music, but the music hits that chord, hits that note inside of you and you respond. That's achievable to me.
I try, and I think I have an emotion I want someone to receive in those moments. Like this is what this poem meant to me, but the minute I release it, I can't control how it's received.
You can. There's that, you know, I'm a dork, man, because I loved T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of Alfred Prufrock. I remember being introduced to it in 18, but there's that one thing where the character, the voice says, I'm not Hamlet and I'm not meant to be. What if I had said something and you... The whole idea is that the person says something and it's misunderstood, and they can't really handle the idea that what they have done or said would be misunderstood. You know, they don't want to take, so they don't do anything, right? They sit around, and I think there are moments creatively where you face that kind of thing. But I think I'm losing myself in it, because I think that really explains the idea. You cannot control what anybody's going to think about the things you write. I'm always amazed by what people see in the work that I never thought. And as a painter, I get a lot of that. If I do an abstraction, somebody tells me, "Oh, I see. Do you see that hand? Do you see that person?" That's the last thing I will ever see. And even when they point it out, I can't see it. But I can negate what they see, right? And so that loss of control, the letting it have its ambiguity, that's, I think, to me, the hallmark of art.
Do you think visual art lends itself more to that ambiguity than poetry?
I do think, because we have this idea that words, we know exactly what they mean till we go to a dictionary and start looking at, well, that's the first meaning, but look at the 17th meaning of that word, right? It's a history. But in painting, in art, I mean, most people don't know the vocabulary, right? They don't know the language. So they try, the mind is always trying to create sense of something. It's trying to order it in a way that it can, you know, your own intellectual systems can just kind of analyze it and say, okay, this is the way I accept it. This is the way it comes into me. And if you don't see the clues right away, then your mind is just creating. And I think, but that's the beauty of art, I think. That's the beauty of painting in particular. I have friends that have an incredible emotional reaction to color, synesthesia, right? But also just in that visual sense of being in front of a work, they can just, I've had friends that cry in front of color. I've never cried in front of color. I've been emotionally engaged, but I've never cried in front of color. So yeah, I think there's something about color that's very distinctly different.
I think about color. I think about, you know, like web design stuff like HTML, color codes and stuff like that. For like red is FF0000, but what does that's what that means to the computer. But red could also mean love, red could mean war, red could be warning, red could be flowers, could be roses, it could be a lot of things, it could be blood. There's just so many things that color could represent. And I think that's why I love abstract work the most, because it's mine. The minute I lay eyes on it, it belongs to me.
Yeah, that's a great thing. You take ownership of the work, right? I think that's the hardest thing sometimes when you make a work of something that it doesn't belong to you anymore in so many ways. What I dislike about art the most, I think, the thing about poetry and fiction and books, you can go in the library and get them. If they happen to end up in the library, you can order them. But a work of art, once you've made it, you can have great resonance with the people that come to your show. They see it, and then somebody buys it, takes it away, and then it's like you'll never see it again. And the reproduction of it can mimic it a little bit, but there's not the emotional response. There's not the presence of the work, and a lot of things get lost that way. They disappear, and I think that's why, in some ways, for me, literature is the most democratic, because all you need is a library card, and you don't have to pay for one. It's free. They give it to you. I mean, your taxes support it, but they give it to you, right? But in a gallery, you'll only see those works that have been collected. But you don't see the majority of the art. It does not belong to you.
It's hoarded in a way.
Yeah. Remember children? Yes.
You've done such interesting collaborations with other artists and thinking about control and ceding control or sharing control, or how it might push your practice in a new direction. I wondered if you could share a little bit about those experiences and what you either gained or lost from them.
You want to go first?
Oh man,
Huascar, I'm thinking of like what you did at the Spencer Museum, for example, with Dario.
that work was a unique experience for me at that time and period. It was a first time the heart, I believe, was a portfolio of images that he reproduced of the first wavelengths that were captured of the heart, and he developed a process to kind of bring this film back to life, and this candle and this smoke, and you could see the wavelengths, and each one of the images had a different name for what the individual was experiencing while they were collecting those heartbeats in wavelength form. First time smelling lilacs, or first time smelling lavender, and those titles lend itself to like poetry in itself, right? Because you're capturing a moment, and I think that's what poets do. We capture a moment, we try to encapsulate it in the essence of it, and being able to bring the visual aspect with the words, and then having me do a poetic sequence, I felt a responsibility to his work, but I felt responsibility in bringing the work to the present, because the original, it was over 100 years old when these images were collected. So like, how do you make work from back then relevant today? I mean, it's relevant because it happened. It was the first time it happened. But how do you tell stories today with images from the past was the challenge I took. I take those opportunities as moments to grow in myself and to challenge myself. And they trusted me, and I'm forever grateful to Dario. And side note, Dario and I went to the same high school in San Antonio. Random moment.
Oh man, that was a beautiful exhibition too, though, because I think the best part of it was seeing the work dialoguing with the other. Then how do you, as an observer, interpret that? I remember I can't remember all of them, the smelling of the roses and how those brainwaves. God, I'd love to imagine if you could do that with poetry or music, right? Like, what does it reproduce those? So it can still be topical, right?
Yes, it
It can still exist in the moment.
Sorry, I don't know if you guys could hear it, but my glasses are turning off on me. They're digital.
Oh my God.
So
They were?
they were turning off at 3% energy on my glasses, but I have 90% this morning. So the sequences I did with that particular project were in response to the climate we were in politically at the moment. You know, it was the Me Too movement was big, so there were images that reflected the heartbeats of someone when they experience a large male or a man smoking a cigar. And I remember this story about Harvey Weinstein on an airplane smoking a cigar when he wasn't supposed to, and how he got kicked off the plane, but nothing happened to him legally. Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking about power dynamics and size and people, and to be able to capture that in 4 frames, 4 visual images with like 10 words, I think that was a challenge that I met that time. Some of the other ones are larger. It didn't go as I wanted, because I wanted more time with it. They're just they came out with white gloves and these images were laid down. They treat art with so much care.
I know.
Visual art gets so much care, but
Not in the artist studio, by the way. I just flip it over.
So you've touched on this before, Jose, but I think there's a very interesting narrative around Latinx writing and art where everything inherently becomes political, whether or not it's intentional. And I'm wondering if this is something that you're actively thinking about whenever you're creating poetry or work.
I don't actively think about it, but I'm very aware of it. So I remember one time, it was actually visual art many years ago when I was still in university doing some work. And somebody said, I would have never known it was you because I expected saguaros and all these other things. They expected, no, it was abstractions, it was color. I was literally just playing with color. And somebody was surprised that they expected what a traditional, and mistaken me, I'm Colombian, they mistakenly thought I was Mexican, so immediately they thought of all those things. So in that moment, it's a political thing, right? Because all of a sudden you're bringing these kind of conceptions of how you feel an artist with a certain cultural background should represent. And I thought, well, I'm never going to paint a painting with a freaking cactus or a or that's not going to be me, because if I do, then I'm kind of making a joke about it, right? But you know what? I painted a painting with a serape. But it became a political statement at that point. It literally was, and I can't remember the image, but it was a class project, and it was the blanket. It was a still life, right? And it was all these classical forms, right? The round, the amphora, the rose, the glass. I mean, it was these things, and it looked very classical. The composition was very classical, and what it was sitting on was a blanket, and it had this really beautiful burgundies and greens. And all I kept thinking was a serape, and not a serape, but a poncho, a colored poncho. So I painted the thing, but I made the thing that it rested on. And so I guess it was a political statement, because an amphora is a Greek vessel, right? The other ones I can't remember, but it was these, what is the one, the Grecian urn, Ode to a Grecian Urn, there was something like that, and those things do not usually sit in a house with serapes, right? So it was commentary. So I'm aware that if I'm not thinking that way, somebody is in receiving the work. I think that's a danger sometimes. I don't want to respond to it all the time, but at the same time, if it leaves ambiguity in there, it works to my advantage, I think.
Does it limit your expression when people assume that is what the work is about, or do you just relinquish?
It used to bother me.
Mm-hmm.
Until somebody pointed out, well, you can get away with so many things. And and the first one was putting Spanish words into your poetry. Because it used to bother me, because I remember the thing about the love song of Alfred Prufrock. He starts out with a German quote, right? It's that thing, in other poems there's the Italian thing. I think it's. But I thought, well, how the hell can you get, now I have to go and freaking look up the phrase, because nobody translates it for you, right, in the book. And I thought that was bad, but I loved the poem so much. And then, when somebody said to me, well, you can do whatever you want. I said, well, I'll use Spanish in my poetry. I'll put some Spanish words in, and not define them, right? Not force somebody to go look them up. So yeah, I guess I can embrace that. It doesn't bother me like it used to.
For me, that's probably the only limitation I can find in poetry is language.
Yeah.
Language being a barrier to other worlds and experiences.
But you put Spanish in
I speak English. Yeah. Spanglish, yeah.
Spanglish.
That's how I grew up, speaking both. We spoke Spanish at home. Occasionally, because we wanted to learn English. When my mother came from Panama, we were living in Texas, and we watched Sesame Street together. And that's how we learned growing up,
My mother put me to work.
Question for both of you. When was the moment you were able to call yourself a poet? Like, what's that journey like?
This is going to sound very conceited, but I had no problem calling myself a poet from the very beginning, because I had a teacher tell me I was a poet. And it was in 7th grade one of my teachers came up to me and said, we're having a food drive for students, and they were pitting the classes against each other, right? He says, our class group is not doing so well. Maybe you could write a poem. And she knew I wrote, so she said, maybe you could write a poem. So I wrote a poem, didn't think much about it, gave it to her. And at that point, she's thinking of me as a poet, right? So I write the poem. The next day I go to class, I get called to the office. And I'm like freaking out. That became a norm for me to get called to the office. But at that point was the first time. And I go and the principal's there and he says, congratulations, young man, something to that effect. We would like for you to read this poem you wrote to your whole school assembly, which is basically just get in front of the microphone. And it went out to all the speakers in all the classroom. And so that was my first public. And man, I tell you, the people that said, hey, I heard you. At that point, I knew I was a poet. I accepted, I got embarrassed, and yeah, that was it for me. I've never doubted that, but I never thought of something that I would make a living out of or try to. It was only when the inspiration hit. Yeah.
Similar, I was really young. I mean, I knew I wanted to be a poet, but I didn't call myself a poet till, for me, a poet was someone that was published. And that didn't happen until 2 years down the road, because I didn't submit anywhere. I rarely submit work. I like to hold my work. I don't want to be rejected sometimes. And sometimes just writing them is enough. But it was S.E. Hinton's Outsider. We had to memorize at the time, it was a Robert Frost poem. What's it called? Nothing Gold Can Say, I think it is. I don't even know if I still remember it, but it was like nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her earliest green a flower, but only so an hour. Like, and in the classroom, and there's more to that poem, but they're like clapping, and I'm like, oh, this feels great. This feels amazing.
You get that response back, right?
Immediately.
That was for me, man. Kids at lunch, you read that poem. You read, and I was like, cool all of a sudden, right?
Yeah. For a little bit.
For a little bit, yeah.
Would you each be willing, you've got your books in front of you, would you be willing to read a passage for us?
Well, actually, I got your book.
To this one?
No, I got mine, actually.
I have yours here too.
Oh, yeah.
You would like to read one from there?
I can read a passage from something. Actually, I want to. You go ahead first.
Do you hear your poems in your own voice, or do you envision Huascar or
I have this.
some other famous person reading your poems?
I love to read other people's poems. I literally do. I make an apology ahead of time because I've been putting them on Facebook and Instagram that I don't know if that's how they meant them to be read. And honestly, the worst experience that I've ever had as a poet is to hear some of my heroes read their poems because they kill them. They crucify them. I mean, they literally, they die on the vein. There's a great a poet, what is her name, Cruz? But the first time I read her poetry, I was so intrigued and in love with it. I just loved the way the cadences and the movement and within the poem. And then I heard her reading, and it was like, so I read this, it's like, it just totally killed me. So no, I'm sorry. I guess I was avoiding. We were actually going to read. Why don't we do this? I'll read one of yours.
All right, I'll read one of yours.
And this is. And it's glad because this one is the first one in this little book, which we all owe a great debt of gratitude to a guy named Jason Rieberg of Spartan Press, because he put out the first book for a lot of us, honestly. He put out about a collection of 56 or more. I think I have about 38 of them. But he was really for us the first chance to write, because like him, I don't like to submit much. But this is a poem, and I love it because Neruda is one of my favorite poets. Spanish knotted feather stitching. Only Neruda can save us. I've written him a plea for guidance, addressed it to the waning crystal moon on that red branch of the now gone autumn in his window. It's clinched with thread to a paloma whom refused to wear the satchel mi abuelita knitted through manos anudado before her passing. El Paloma argued for practicality, balancing against my need for sentimentality. The added weight of things makes flight onerous, he'd say. How I wish this bird was more passenger pigeon, less dove, willing to fight through wind and rain to get there. Okay with war and loss. I even taught him to fly in cursive, in case he didn't make it, before he's shot down, so others may see the phrases passing by, but very few people see the need for soft, round words, free and flowing in the air. His grace appeared indecisive, almost lost from below, how they've pitied him, poor Paloma. I beg of you, please, take this note to his shores, sing towards the sill in his view, be candid, have manners, wipe the sand from your feet before entering, bathe in his cafe, perch yourself upon his fingerpiece. I just have to know, can a song of despair come before our love poem? And to me, the most beautiful lines in it are, I even taught him to fly in cursive. I mean, I can just imagine sparrows, the murmurations and the way these things move. I mean, that's cursive of the most beautiful, and that image just comes to me so strongly.
Thank you. It's a beautiful read of that. I will never read that poem as much as you did.
I embarrass poets because they don't like it, I guess, after I do it. I don't know.
Yeah, that's. Thank you for sharing that. And that one also appeared in the second collection.
Yeah, which is the start.
A slight change, minimal change in it.
I was going to look for that. I didn't have time.
Do you mind if I share one of yours?
No, go ahead.
And I have a question for you after.
Sure.
Okay. So, this is from the life and times of José Calderón. When I talk. This is number 28.
Oh, man.
I don't want to be old, tired, stretched, useless, afraid belt, a silent record. I want to shout, not end up squeaking. Perhaps if I started over, listen to me when I walk one step in front of the other. I spin the earth beneath me. Maybe I walk too fast. My feet don't grip. The earth stands still. There's that reference to age in there. I always wonder about that. You know, I believe you can divide into like 7 pieces. You know, we live to be about 75. Some of my dad's 77. I don't know. But,
I'm going for 120.
I hope so. But are there things that you wish you would have written differently earlier or done differently sooner? Do you spend any time in that space?
I go into that space against my better judgment and against my will. I fight it, and I don't stay there very long. It's literally a fleeting moment, because I think that kind of space is very dangerous, because you end up thinking, well, where are all the things that I could have done? Where are all the things I did? And in between, where are all the things that were left unsaid, not even thought upon? And that's a big chasm, right? I mean, because it's, you know, every day of your life you could do something, right? What is it? William Stafford wrote a poem every day for a long time till he had like 20,000 poems. And if you measure yourself by that, there's so many things you haven't done that you kind of forget the things you have done. And there are people that remind me, because I've had those dark moments. And in conversation, they'll say to you, but you've done this, right? Well, it didn't measure up in that moment, right? Because you're questioning. And I think that kind of questioning can propose you to knuckle down, or it can sideline you to where you just kind of like embrace that, the imposter syndrome, what they call it. Or you can do what I do a lot of times, which is go have a drink, think about it. And it can be coffee, it can be whatever. But yeah, no, but it happens. It happens, yeah.
Yeah, I find myself sometimes looking into that rear view, still trying to go forward. It's very difficult to do.
Does it push you?
It's a point of reference, right? I know where I do not want to be. It's how I utilize that space. But I'm trying to stay away from it more now and be in the present. You know, when I was younger, there was nothing but the future ahead of me. There was no past. I was just living a rebellious young life as a poet. Like, I really wanted to live that life as a poet, traveling, drinking. That was just the life for a while, you know. But that's just, it's romantic and destructive at the same time. And it's not very productive at the end if you have other people in your life.
I think about in Neruda's autobiography, he talks about roaming the streets, the town he grew up in, knowing he was going to be a poet. I mean, this was a guy, you know, when they checked him out of the hospital after his birth, poet, great one, will win a Nobel. I mean, he just had that in his mind. But he adapting what he thought was the traje, the costume of the poet, right? Mm-hmm. The long robe, the coat that was extended long, the cap off kilter, and then walking into the world the way that people define a poet to be, you know. So poets or artists are very bohemian. They walk tight ropes. You'd love to have a drink with them, but you wouldn't want them to come to your house. I mean, that kind of thing, right? And so they embraced that. And to me, that was, it was in my mind. I wore a jacket, you know, the winter was a long coat. In summer, it was a bomber jacket. In the spring, leather jacket. There was always this idea that I should dress a certain way. And then after a while, it was like, screw it, man. What do I have in the closet? What'll still fit? You know? So,
I'm trying to spend more time in my inner life now than I did before. I think I was spending a lot of time trying to show people that I was a poet rather than actually like thinking and living as one, like living artfully, right?
what is living artfully?
For me, it's always aware of awe and open to it, and always questioning and accepting doubt in things that are beautiful and that are around you at all times.
Yeah, I love that image you asked. Is it, what is that last line? I just have to know, can a song of despair come before a love poem, right? That idea, you're always trying to balance these different extremes. One of the things that bothers me the most is when I hear poets say, well, I don't really write love poetry. It's just somehow it's bad, or somehow it's so challenging. But to me, you can have a morning where you wake up and it's really the freaking saddest moment. You've had a dream that has wakened something in you, and nothing's going to change it. That whole day is colored. Noontime, you've eaten, you've gotten something else, walked around, maybe ran into somebody, said hello, goodbye. All of a sudden, the rest of the day is a beautiful day, right? And it's the same thing to me with that question, you know, can a song of despair and a poem, love poem, well, the only real distinction is, does it come in the morning or the afternoon? Because they have to kind of live together. So yeah.
So time.
Time
is, I think I contend with, do I have enough time to wait for, or am I impatient because I want to get past the despair to the love of the thing that I'm doing.
But the one thing about you is you were thrust in a position where you couldn't doubt whether you were a poet or not. Yeah. You became a Poet Laureate of Kansas. And you can't walk around and say, oh, really, I'm not a poet. You're a laureate, right? And that
there's a pressure with that, right? Mm-hmm. Also, you know, we talk about, you asked a question earlier about politics and art and that, and being the first Latino Poet Laureate, the questions were, what was my work about, right? And it was lived experience, but it was seen as political, because to be a Latino writer in America, as Martin Espada says, is for your work to inherently be political. Yeah. Because we're caught in that in-between space of belonging and not belonging, and other people trying to make those decisions for us.
Yeah, and then going into rural Kansas and having readings in places where you are really, by just the luck of the draw, only the second Latino that's been there ever. You know, that's a very distinct. And then to be representing an art form that the whole purpose of which your mission is to expand the audience for it, right?
Yeah. To bring people in, and how do I bring them into some of those dark things that the Canary is singing about, right? Yeah. In a way that doesn't harm them or alienate them from my lived experience in Kansas, which may be different than theirs. You know, I always say, I like to say that poetry allows us to say hard things in soft ways, and I've always entered those spaces with vulnerability and humility, even though I might be saying that the way that I'm being treated is incorrect.
Yeah, it's very true.
Is it possible to translate poetry successfully into another language?
I always quote this line, Frost said it, poetry is what's lost in translation. But there's a poet, what is his name? Francisco Aragon. He talked about, he's a translator, and he talked about this idea that I can't quite translate that poem exactly. There's no way. The words have different resonances in your own language. But he says, I am crafting a new poem based on the structures and the things that are in that first one. So that took me a long time to understand it, because I love the Heights of Machu Picchu, the poem of Neruda. But I struggle with the translation of it. It just doesn't, in some areas it doesn't sound right to me, right?
The music doesn't jive.
The music doesn't jive, but the sentiment is there in some passages, totally, or else it wouldn't be a great translation. But yeah, I struggle with that sometimes. But I think if you speak the language, and you're familiar with it, that's a different experience than somebody that is not experienced in the language. Then it has to be what the translation is about. I love this poet, what is her name? Wisława Szymborska. She's a Polish poet. She's one of my favorite poets right now. She won the Nobel Peace Prize, but her words, whoever translates them in English has created some very beautiful translations. And I have to accept them as being what she meant, or what that poem is right now. That's what's important. But I know that if I spoke Polish, the things this poem would do for me would be slightly different than the thing it would enrich the experience.
I feel that way about Roca. His work is still being translated, constantly changed, and it does lose some of its essence. It's just like music. The syllable count changes the meter. If you change the meter in a song, it changes the mood of the song. So I think it's the same thing for poetry.
It's kind of interesting when you talk about poets. Bolaño said that poets can be the biggest cowards, but they have to be valiente enough to understand that cowards. And I think about how do you, as poets, you understand that there are other things, we see each other differently. Mm-hmm. So how, if you are the canary singing a nice song for this entrapment that we are, how do you leave with the hawks?
Somebody said it once, artists should always bite the hand that feeds them. We should be like mendicants out there. Please give us. And when you give us, oh crap, I'm gonna bite you. I face that sometimes. So when a situation comes up, I'm a political person. I have political opinions. But I think I'm past the time where I would go to the barricades, right? Not for many reasons, but primarily of age, things change. But there's always this intense desire to respond to the moment as a citizen of the world, not just of this country, of the world. I mean, and that vehicle is poetry. And I'll sit there sometimes and I'll feel exactly like a coward, because the moment something strikes me, it moves me in a passion. I feel a desire to respond. No phrases come, nothing jumps in, and I feel like, is it because I'm afraid in this moment? Because obviously we live in such situations where if you take a political stand, it immediately, you become a target. So you think, am I not writing because I'm afraid this time? And it's a struggle, man. I do fight myself sometimes to say the things I say, but I can't breathe as myself if I don't say them. So yeah, we have to admit we're cowards. But even a coward has a moment of balance, right? Yeah.
Ernest Hemingway, I think of For Whom the Bell Tolls and El Trondo. I think of that character quite a bit. And I'm like, am I one who is going to blow the bridge up or invite people over to the side of the bridge? When does that work start? And are we into a position where, because it's too easy to say that all this work is going to create some type of liberation, but it hasn't happened yet. Those are individualistic goals that we need to set for ourselves. I have yet to see an organization or institution offer me liberation. So I'm going to have to provide that for myself, and that begins with me, the individual, and it shows up in my work when I choose to allow it to, for myself.
You know, the hardest thing as an artist who believes that art is a transformative agent is to accept that I can't give you the evidence for it, right? I can't sit here and tell you, you know, the Greeks had a great society, look at all the art they made. When you think about the horrors of the Peloponnesian War, if you read things about that war, and then you read about the subsequent things when Alexander takes over and all those things that happen, but yet that art is so incredible, right? But that's, I think, that's part of being human. I think that's the contradiction, and that's what you have to do as an artist. I still remember when Amir Baraka was Poet Laureate, God, what was it? And he had to take a stand on something, and he had no qualms about it. This was a man that was fearless. And he just like went out and did it, and they immediately took away his Poet Laureateship. Because how dare you? Well, how dare he not? I think is more the question.
I felt a great deal of sadness reading Juan Felipe Herrera's book. Every day we become more illegal. I mean, after having that position, and we're still having the same dialogue and the same issues brought up year after year. It's like every election cycle, we're back in the same conversation. How does that change? Are there words missing? Are there sentiments not being shared? Because I feel that they have been. I think people are just not listening. And how do we get them to listen? I don't know.
We have a mechanism, I think, that keeps us living, and that is that we can very easily forget. You know, we can categorize things and put them into that little drawer and seal it. And then when we look around us, we find people that enforce that because our circle of friends think the same way. And so if they're not bringing it up and I'm not bringing it up and I put it in my drawer, I'm okay. Until that drawer opens up by itself.
Yeah. We've both spoken about the transformative impact of art and poetry on your own life. Is that what motivates you in your social activist work and mentorship to be able to bring poetry to new generations and people who may not have it as part of their life?
Man, I hope this doesn't make any of you cry. But in a way, I hope it does. I was invited to give it was seventh graders, poetry class with seventh graders. And I remember it was Lee Tolbert over on 34th and Paseo. And I go in, there's all these seventh grade kids, and the teacher has prepared them. So they know a poet's coming, we're gonna write poetry. And I remember this one girl sitting like right where we are, Rodrigo, she goes, she raised her hand up. And right after I introduced myself, she said, "I'm not going to write a poem. You're not going to get me to write a poem." And I said, "Well, that's a challenge." I remember by the time we got on with the class and we went to have lunch, we're going to sit. She comes running up. She's yelling, "I've written my third poem." She had 3 poems she had written. So the whole purpose of that class was the kids would write a poem, we'd help them craft it, and then I'd come back the next week and we would sit there and talk about what revision is and what it's like. So I go there, and this girl that was so enthusiastic, who had just literally made my whole freaking existence worthwhile in that moment. We stepped into the hallway. We have little desks set up for her and I to interact. And she's quiet, and she's moody, and she doesn't talk. And I'm saying, "Well, are you okay?" And then finally a tear starts coming out of her eyes. And I stop, I just close the poetry, I say, "What's the matter?" She said, "Last night I couldn't sleep, it was so late. I didn't get to bed till like 2 or 3 in the morning." And I said, "Well, that's you know, what the hell are you doing here?" You know, I mean, I could understand that kids do that. But then she told me why. She said she had a niece, her niece was living with them. The mother was not around, so her grandmother was taking care of all the kids. And she was the one responsible because her niece her cousin, had asthma. So whenever her asthma was triggered, she was the one that was around and would always make sure she got the inhaler. That night they went to mass. They went to, not mass, but they went to a church service. So the little girl was left behind with her grandmother. Grandmother fell asleep, the girl fell asleep. In the middle of her sleep, woke up choking, came running to her room to find her. She wasn't there because she was at the service. Her sister was there, but she couldn't wake her up. The girl turned, walked out to the thing and collapsed and died in there. And in that moment, what the hell did poetry matter, right? I mean, I didn't have anything for her. And I remember the poem we were writing was, if there was somebody in your life that you could create a meal for them, what would it be? And she had written one about her uncle who had been killed, younger. And so we just sat there, and in that moment I said, let's fix a meal for your cousin that died. And that was the only thing that turned it around. But to me, the saddest thing about it was, what was that little girl doing in school that day? Where were the support mechanisms that would have said, no, you need guarding, you need taken care of, you need to be held, you need to be embraced and loved. None of that was there. So, yeah, I want to believe that art can change the world. I have to accept that sometimes I don't know how the hell it's going to do it. But, you know, you have to do it, you have to try it. So.
Yes.
I think you provided that support that she needed that day.
I hope so. She totally impacted me. I've never forgotten her. Come on, cheer up. Yeah.
On a lighter note, Huascar, you wrote in your book that you said that Kansas City has been good to you. Can you expand on that feeling?
Yeah, so I moved here from San Antonio. My aunt raised me. She took me in when I was turning 14. I ran away from home when I was 12. And living in the city, it sounds different, it hums different, right? And it just, a metropolitan area has more diverse culture. There's more people who look like you. Because when I moved here, it was 2001, and I was in Holton, Kansas, is where I ended up. I caught a Greyhound.
A lot of Latinos there.
Not where I was at. And I would drive by myself to Kansas City to go dancing, to listen to some music. What was that? It's a theater here, Chesterfield. Do you remember Chesterfield? They used to have salsa night over there. And I used to go out there, put on a lot of cologne, and go drink some mojitos. Yeah, but that's, that poem is a surrogate city, and I talk about that. I talk about Old Paso Puente, and you know that's just like it's a direct line from the south north. You know, if you take 35, I was thinking about that when I wrote that poem. You know,
that's a beautiful highway too, all the way straight to the border.
Yeah.
This hour has flown by, but we have time for one more question.
I mean, in the lighter note of things, it's just like, yeah, like when you talk about the highway, that's a privilege to drive it because there is another route that comes around here that is the train that goes from El Paso all the way to Chicago. Mm-hmm. And you see around the places that this station stops, Latin Americans are there because they jump off. Sometimes because they're very hungry. Sometimes because they just want to stop there. Most of them want to go to Chicago. They don't get there from El Paso, so they just start camping out. And that's, you know, like the roots of all that. So I feel like when you talk about like what poets do maybe to change the world is that you feed the revolutionaries to actually do the things that you're dreaming about.
Mm. That's a good thing to think.
Well, to think that, to see a child feel empowered with the words that I've written, to be able to use those words when they don't have words themselves to express the situation they're in. To me, that is enough for them to wear that voice, you know, to take on that voice at any age, and to make the work easily translatable to a room of people, because I don't want to be lost in translation in the work that I'm sharing. It's really important to me that it's accessible.
I think when you were saying that, I thought about the train, La Bestia, right? And as it's going through, and you see these people that get up every morning, and absent all the political crap that is thrown at it, they see humanity on that train. And they literally, and there's these women too, I've seen some great videos, they create these big tons of food and they put it in sacks, and as the train is going by, they're holding it out there and people are catching it as they're going out, because it's not going to stop where they're at. And I think it's not a government policy, it's not anything, it's just this idea that, but for the grace of God, we could be on that train. It could be us. And if we look deep enough into our histories and scratch it away, that is our shared history. All of us have this shared history. It's not, we may have to go back further, beyond our privilege, but that should not be foreign to us. Those should be the stories that we celebrate, right? And yeah.
Thank you both. So. And thank you all for coming today. I do want to let you know, if you enjoyed today's program, the library's next program will be in June and will be about creating a journal based and inspired by Mickey de St. Paul's work, the featured exhibition that just opened today. Thank you again for attending today's program. If you'd like to purchase copies of their books, they are in the museum store, and I think you will both be available to sign them if you'd like. So I encourage you to make a stop down there if you'd like a copy of those books. And just thank you again for coming, and thank you again to our wonderful poets for participating today.